When desperation strips away everything you thought you knew about healing, sometimes the answer comes from the place you least expect to find it. Kwame Asante stood in the sterile hallway of Chicago's Northwestern Memorial Hospital, clutching a crumpled eviction notice in one hand and his daughter Ama's medical bills in the other. 3 years of specialists, surgeries, and experimental treatments had drained every dollar he'd saved from his construction job, and still, 8-year-old Ama hadn't taken a single step since the car accident that had shattered her spine. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The neurologist's words echoed in his mind as he watched his daughter through the window of her physical therapy session. Permanent paralysis below the waist. No sensation, no motor function. I'm sorry, Mr. Asante, but miracles don't happen in spinal cord injuries. But Kwame had seen miracles before, in the red dust of Ghana's Upper East region where he'd grown up, where his grandmother Nana Akosua had taught him that some healing came not from medicine, but from the ancient rhythms that connected the body to the earth itself. Kwame had arrived in Chicago 15 years ago with nothing but a mechanical engineering degree from the University of Ghana and dreams of building a better life for the family he hoped to create. He'd met Sarah Williams at a community college where he was taking English classes, and she was studying pediatric nursing. She had fallen in love with his stories of home, the way he could make her laugh with his impressions of his village elders, and how his eyes lit up when he talked about the traditional dances his grandfather had taught him. Their wedding had been a fusion of cultures that reflected their hopes for the future. Sarah's family had embraced Kwame with the warmth of people who understood that love transcended borders, while Kwame's relatives had traveled from Ghana to celebrate their union with drumming and dancing that lasted until dawn. When Ama was born, she had inherited her mother's bright smile and her father's determined spirit, along with an unusual grace that made her seem to float when she moved. The accident had happened on a Tuesday morning in October. Sarah was driving Ama to school when a drunk driver ran a red light and slammed into their car at 40 miles per hour. Sarah died instantly from internal injuries, while Ama survived with a crushed T12 vertebra that left her paralyzed from the waist down. In a single moment, Kwame had lost his wife and watched his daughter's world shrink to the dimensions of a wheelchair. The grief counselor at the hospital had warned Kwame about the stages of loss, but no one had prepared him for how those stages would spiral and repeat, how denial would give way to anger, then bargaining, then depression, only to cycle back through again with each failed treatment. He had thrown himself into research, becoming an expert on spinal cord injuries, experimental procedures, stem cell therapies, and rehabilitation techniques. He had liquidated his retirement fund, sold their house, and moved into a one-bedroom apartment near the hospital so Ama could receive the best possible care. Dr. Patricia Hendricks, Ama's primary neurologist, had been patient but firm in her prognosis. The injury was complete, meaning no nerve function remained below the point of damage. The spinal cord was not a broken bone that could heal or a muscle that could be retrained. When those nerve pathways were severed, they were gone forever. Physical therapy could help Ama build upper body strength and learn to navigate the world from a wheelchair, but it would never restore her ability to walk. Kwame had accepted this intellectually while rejecting it emotionally. He continued working double shifts at the construction company, saving every penny for potential treatments, while researching clinical trials and experimental procedures. He had driven Ama to appointments at Mayo Clinic, Johns Hopkins, and the Shepherd Center in Atlanta, seeking second opinions that all delivered the same devastating verdict. The medical establishment was unanimous in its certainty that Ama would never walk again. The financial pressure was crushing. Even with insurance, the medical bills were astronomical. The adapted van Ama needed cost $40,000. The wheelchair-accessible apartment required expensive modifications. The specialized equipment for her daily care seemed to multiply weekly. Kwame's construction salary, which had once seemed adequate for a middle-class life, was no match for the endless expenses of caring for a disabled child. 3 months ago, Kwame had been forced to take out a predatory loan against his truck to pay for an experimental stem cell treatment in Mexico. The procedure had cost $12,000 and produced no results except to deepen his debt and fuel Ama's growing depression. She had begun to understand that her father was sacrificing everything for treatments that weren't working, and the guilt was eating away at her spirit as surely as the accident had damaged her spine. The eviction notice had arrived that morning, giving them 30 days to vacate their apartment. The loan payments on his truck were 3 months behind. His credit cards were maxed out. The construction company had been understanding about his frequent absences for Ama's appointments, but work was slowing down as winter approached, and hours were being cut across the board. Standing in that hospital hallway, watching Ama struggle through another futile physical therapy session, Kwame felt the weight of failure pressing down on him like a collapsing building. He had immigrated to America believing that determination and hard work could overcome any obstacle, but 3 years of trying to heal his daughter had taught him that some problems were bigger than individual effort could solve. His phone buzzed with a text message from his sister Akosua, who still lived in their village of Bolgatanga. The message was brief but somehow managed to convey both sympathy and gentle criticism. Kwame, you cannot heal Ama by running from who you are. Nana Akosua says the ancestors are calling, but you have forgotten how to listen. Kwame stared at the message for a long moment. His grandmother had died 2 years ago, but Akosua still consulted the village's traditional healer and maintained the old ways that Kwame had abandoned in his pursuit of American medical miracles. The suggestion that traditional healing could help Ama seemed not just naive, but almost insulting after everything they had endured. Yet something about his sister's words stirred a memory that had been buried under years of medical terminology and insurance forms. He remembered being 7 years old, watching his grandfather perform the Kepen logo dance during harvest season. The old man had been recovering from a stroke that had left his left side partially paralyzed, but when the drums began, something had transformed in his body. His movements had been fluid and powerful, as if the rhythm had awakened pathways that medical examinations had declared dead. Dr. Hendricks emerged from Ama's therapy session with the carefully neutral expression she wore when delivering disappointing news. Ama's progress had plateaued months ago, and today's session had been particularly difficult. The 8-year-old had grown frustrated with exercises that seemed pointless, and she had asked her therapist the question that haunted Kwame's dreams. Why do I have to keep trying if I'm never going to get better? She's getting depressed. Dr. Hendricks told Kwame as they watched Ama wheel herself slowly down the hallway. It's common in children with permanent disabilities as they begin to understand the reality of their situation. I'd like to recommend a pediatric psychiatrist who specializes in trauma and adjustment disorders. Another specialist, another layer of complexity, another monthly payment plan that would push them deeper into debt. Kwame, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Nodded his agreement, while his mind raced through calculations he had performed hundreds of times. How many more months could he maintain this routine before the money ran out completely? How many more failed treatments could Ama endure before her spirit broke entirely? That evening, in their cramped apartment, Kwame sat beside Ama's bed and read her the same story he had been reading since she was 3 years old. It was a Ghanaian folktale about Anansi the spider, who used cleverness and determination to overcome seemingly impossible challenges. Ama had always loved the story, but tonight she interrupted him before he reached the end. "Daddy, do you think Anansi would be able to make me walk again?" Kwame's throat tightened as he looked into his daughter's eyes. She had inherited Sarah's expressive gaze, but lately her eyes held a sadness that no 8-year-old should have to carry. "I don't know, sweetheart, but I know that Anansi never gave up trying to solve problems, even when they seemed impossible." "Maybe some problems can't be solved," Ama said quietly. "Maybe some things are just broken forever." The resignation in her voice was more devastating than any medical diagnosis. Kwame realized that in his desperate pursuit of a physical cure, he had been losing sight of the spiritual healing that his daughter needed just as urgently. She wasn't just struggling with paralyzed legs. She was struggling with a paralyzed sense of hope. After Ama fell asleep, Kwame sat at his laptop and opened a video call with his sister. Akosua's face appeared on the screen, framed by the familiar backdrop of their family compound in Bolgatanga. Even through the pixelated connection, he could see the concern in her eyes. "You look tired, brother," she said in Twi, their native language. "Are you taking care of yourself?" "I'm trying to take care of Ama," he replied in English, as had become his habit over the years. The doctors here are the best in the world, but nothing is working. The doctors are treating her body, Akosua said gently. But what about her spirit? What about the connections that make us whole? Kwame was about to dismiss this as superstition when his sister held up her own daughter, 3-year-old Efua, who had been born with a club foot. Western medicine would have required multiple surgeries and years of casting, but the village healer had worked with Efua's parents to develop a treatment plan that combined gentle manipulation with traditional dances designed to strengthen specific muscle groups. The little girl's foot was now completely normal. "I know what you're thinking," Akosua continued. "You think the old ways are primitive, that Western medicine has all the answers. But healing has many forms, Kwame. Sometimes the body needs to remember what the mind has forgotten." After ending the call, Kwame found himself walking to the closet where he kept a box of items from his childhood in Ghana. He hadn't opened it since they moved to the smaller apartment, but tonight he felt drawn to the memories it contained. Inside, wrapped in faded kente cloth, were the talking drums his grandfather had given him on his 16th birthday. The drums were smaller than the ones used in formal ceremonies, designed for personal practice and meditation. As Kwame lifted the drums from their cloth wrapping, he felt a familiar weight that had nothing to do with their physical mass. These instruments had connected him to generations of ancestors, to rhythms that had pulsed through West African communities for thousands of years. He had abandoned them when he immigrated to America, believing that success required leaving old traditions behind. He placed the drums on his kitchen table and touched the stretched goatskin heads tentatively. Even after 15 years of storage, they still held their tuning reasonably well. When he tapped out a simple rhythm, the sound transported him instantly to the dusty courtyard of his family compound, where his grandfather had taught him that every dance told a story, and every story held the power to heal. The next morning, Kwame called in sick to work and spent the day researching something he had never thought to investigate during 3 years of medical consultations. He searched for information about traditional healing practices from West Africa, specifically focusing on treatments for paralysis and neurological conditions. What he found challenged everything he thought he knew about the intersection of culture and medicine. Studies conducted by anthropologists and medical researchers had documented cases throughout West Africa of people recovering from neurological conditions through traditional healing practices that combined herbal medicine, ritualistic movement, and community support. The mechanisms weren't fully understood by Western science, but the results were difficult to dismiss. People who had been paralyzed by strokes, accidents, and degenerative diseases were walking again after participating in specific traditional healing ceremonies. The most intriguing research came from a medical anthropologist named Dr. Rebecca Morrison, who had spent 20 years studying traditional healing practices in Ghana's Upper East region. Her peer-reviewed papers described a treatment protocol called Korobom, which used rhythmic movement, drumming, and community participation to stimulate neurological recovery in cases where conventional medicine had failed. Dr. Morrison's research suggested that certain traditional dances created neurological stimulation patterns that could potentially activate dormant nerve pathways. The combination of rhythmic sound, focused movement, and communal energy seemed to trigger healing responses that Western medicine couldn't explain but couldn't deny. Her most documented case involved a young man who had been paralyzed in a motorcycle accident and had regained full mobility after 6 months of traditional treatment. Kwame spent hours reading Dr. Morrison's research, cross-referencing her findings with studies on neuroplasticity and alternative healing methods. The science was preliminary and controversial, but it suggested that healing might be more complex and culturally specific than he had assumed. What worked in American hospitals might not be the only path to recovery, and what seemed impossible to Western medicine might be achievable through approaches that honored different ways of understanding the human body. That afternoon, when he picked up Amma from her regular physical therapy session, he noticed something that had been invisible to him for months. While the American therapists focused on building upper body strength and teaching wheelchair skills, they completely ignored Amma's connection to her cultural heritage. The exercises were clinical and impersonal, designed to help her adapt to disability rather than to explore possibilities for recovery. "Daddy, why do you look different today?" Amma asked as they drove home from the hospital. "You seem less sad." Kwame glanced at his daughter in the rearview mirror. She was perceptive beyond her years, attuned to emotional subtleties that adults often missed. "I've been thinking about your great-grandfather's stories," he said. about the dances he used to do and how they made people feel stronger. "Will you show me sometime?" Amma asked. "I know I can't dance with my legs, but maybe I could learn the hand movements." The request hit Kwame like a physical blow. In his focus on repairing Amma's damaged spine, he had completely neglected to share the cultural traditions that had shaped his own identity. His daughter knew almost nothing about her Ghanaian heritage beyond the bedtime stories he occasionally told her. She had never heard traditional music, never seen authentic traditional dances, never experienced the communal energy that had sustained his people through centuries of challenges. That evening, Kwame set up his grandfather's drums in their small living room and began to play the basic rhythms he remembered from his childhood. The sound seemed to transform the sterile apartment, filling the space with echoes of home and history. Amma wheeled herself closer to the drums, her eyes wide with curiosity. "These rhythms tell stories," Kwame explained, his hands finding patterns he hadn't played in 15 years. "This one is about the harvest, when the community comes together to celebrate the year's abundance. This one is about hunters returning safely from the forest. And this one," he paused, his hands moving into a complex polyrhythmic pattern. "This one is about healing." As the healing rhythm filled the room, something unexpected happened. Amma's upper body began to move in response to the music, her arms swaying in patterns that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. The movement was fluid and natural, as if she was accessing genetic memories that connected her to ancestors she had never met. For the first time since the accident, Kwame saw joy in his daughter's face that wasn't forced or temporary. The music was awakening something in her that medical treatments had never touched, a sense of connection and identity that transcended physical limitations. As he played, he realized that healing might not be about fixing what was broken. It might be about remembering what had never been lost. Over the next week, Kwame established a new routine. Every evening after Amma's hospital-based therapy, they would spend an hour exploring traditional Ghanaian music and movement. Kwame taught her the hand gestures and upper body movements that accompanied different dances, while she absorbed the rhythms with an intuitive understanding that amazed him. The change in Amma's demeanor was immediate and dramatic. She began looking forward to their cultural sessions with an enthusiasm she hadn't shown for anything since the accident. Her appetite improved, her sleep became more restful, and she started talking about their evening music time with her physical therapists and doctors. Dr. Hendricks noticed the change during Amma's next appointment. The 8-year-old was more engaged during therapy, more willing to push herself through difficult exercises, and more optimistic about her overall situation. When the neurologist asked what had changed at home, Amma launched into an excited description of the traditional dances her father was teaching her. "It's interesting," Dr. Hendricks told Kwame privately after the session. "Sometimes we see improvement in patients, overall health and motivation when they engage with activities that give them a sense of cultural identity and purpose. The mind-body connection is stronger than we often recognize in clinical settings." Kwame found himself wondering how many other parents in similar situations had never thought to explore their cultural traditions as part of the healing process. American medicine was undeniably advanced, but it was also culturally narrow, focused on fixing individual problems without considering the broader context of identity, community, and spiritual well-being. His research into traditional healing led him to discover something that would change everything. Dr. Rebecca Morrison, the medical anthropologist whose work had first caught his attention, was currently living in Chicago, serving as a visiting professor at Northwestern University. She was conducting a research study on the effectiveness of culturally integrated healing approaches for neurological conditions, specifically focusing on African diaspora communities in major American cities. Kwame spent a sleepless night debating whether to contact Dr. Morrison. His years in America had taught him to be skeptical of anything that seemed too good to be true, and the idea that traditional healing could succeed where modern medicine had failed felt almost too hopeful to pursue. But when he looked at Amma's increased vitality during their evening cultural sessions, he realized that something was already working, even if he didn't understand the mechanism. The next morning, Kwame sent Dr. Morrison an email explaining his situation and asking if she might be willing to meet with him. He expected either no response or a polite referral to other resources. Instead, Dr. Morrison called him within hours, and her voice carried an excitement that surprised him. "Mr. Asante, your timing is remarkable," she said. I'm currently recruiting families for a pilot study that combines traditional West African healing practices with conventional medical care. Your daughter's case sounds exactly like what we're designed to address. Dr. Morrison explained that her research had identified specific traditional healing protocols that showed promise for neurological recovery. The approach didn't reject Western medicine, but rather integrated traditional practices in ways that seemed to enhance the body's natural healing capabilities. The study was fully approved by Northwestern's Medical Ethics Board and would be conducted in collaboration with the hospital, where Amma was already receiving care. I have to be honest with you, Dr. Morrison continued. We're not promising miracles, and we don't know exactly how or why these traditional approaches sometimes work. But we've seen results that conventional medicine can't explain, and we think the combination of cultural healing with standard care might offer possibilities that neither approach can achieve alone. The study would require Amma and Kwame to participate in traditional healing ceremonies conducted by a master healer who had been brought from Ghana specifically for this research. The sessions would combine drumming, dancing, herbal treatments, and community support with careful medical monitoring to track any changes in Amma's neurological function. Kwame felt a familiar surge of hope mixed with the fear of disappointment that had characterized the past 3 years. Every previous treatment had begun with optimism and ended with frustration. But something about Dr. Morrison's approach felt different. She wasn't promising to cure Amora's paralysis. She was offering to explore healing from a completely different cultural and spiritual perspective. That evening, Kwame explained the opportunity to Amma, being careful not to raise expectations that might be crushed later. To his surprise, his 8-year-old daughter listened with the seriousness of an adult making a major life decision. "Will I get to learn real dances from Ghana?" she asked. "Not just the hand movements, but the stories and meanings behind them?" "Yes, sweetheart. You'll learn about your heritage in ways I never taught you before." Amma was quiet for a long moment, her small hands resting on the wheels of her chair. "Daddy, I know you want me to walk again. And I want that too. But what I want most is to feel like I belong somewhere, like I'm part of something bigger than just being the girl who can't walk." Her words pierced through Kwame's single-minded focus on physical recovery and revealed the deeper healing his daughter needed. She wasn't just struggling with damaged nerves and paralyzed muscles. She was struggling with disconnection from her identity, her community, and her sense of purpose in the world. The next week, Kwame and Amma arrived at Northwestern University for their first meeting with the traditional healer who would guide their participation in the study. Nana Akosua was a man in his 70s who carried himself with the quiet dignity that Kwame remembered from the elders of his childhood. His eyes held the deep wisdom that came from a lifetime of understanding healing as something that encompassed body, mind, spirit, and community. Nana Akosua examined Amma not with medical instruments but with a gentle attention that took in her entire presence. He asked questions that no Western doctor had ever posed. How did she feel about her connection to her ancestors? What dreams had she been having since the accident? Did she feel any sensations in her legs during their evening drumming sessions? To Kwame's surprise, Amma answered these questions with thoughtful precision. She described dreams of running through red dust under an African sky, sensations of warmth in her legs when the drumming reached certain rhythms, and a feeling of emptiness where her connection to her father's homeland should have been. "This child's spirit is strong," Nana Akosua told Kwame in Twi, "but it has been cut off from its roots. The accident damaged more than her spine. It severed her connection to the life force that flows through her family line. We must heal the spiritual disconnection before we can address the physical manifestation." Dr. Morrison, who had been observing the session, took careful notes while respecting the traditional healer's process. Her research had taught her that effective cultural healing required creating space for approaches that Western science couldn't yet measure or explain. The treatment protocol Nana Akosua designed for Amma was unlike anything Kwame could have imagined. It began with a cleansing ceremony that would reconnect her to her ancestral lineage, followed by specific dance movements designed to stimulate nerve pathways while honoring the spiritual dimensions of healing. The approach would combine traditional herbal remedies with rhythmic movement, community support, and what Nana Akosua called ancestral intervention. "The ancestors are always present," the healer explained to Kwame. "But modern life creates barriers that prevent their healing energy from reaching us. Your daughter's recovery will require removing those barriers and allowing the ancient wisdom to flow through her body." As they left the university that day, Kwame felt something he hadn't experienced since the accident. Not hope for a specific outcome, but peace with a process that honored both his daughter's medical needs and their cultural identity. For the first time in 3 years, healing felt like something bigger than just fixing broken parts. The next phase of their journey would test everything Kwame thought he knew about recovery, medicine, and the power of cultural traditions to transform lives in ways that science was only beginning to understand. The traditional healing ceremonies began on a Tuesday morning in November, when Chicago's wind carried the first promise of winter through the university's medical research facility. Kwame pushed Ama's wheelchair through corridors that smelled of antiseptic and institutional coffee, but today they were heading towards something that felt entirely different from their usual medical appointments. Dr. Morrison had arranged for the sessions to take place in a specially prepared room that bore no resemblance to a typical medical facility. The walls had been painted in earth tones, and woven African textiles created intimate spaces within the larger room. Traditional musical instruments lined shelves along the walls, while the floor was covered with intricate patterns drawn in colored sand that represented ancestral symbols from various West African cultures. Nana Akosua was already present when they arrived, along with 3 other participants in the research study. There was Maria Santos, a 30-year-old dancer from Brazil whose legs had been crushed in a construction accident, accompanied by her husband Roberto. Beside them sat James Wheeler, a 65-year-old jazz musician from Chicago's South Side, who had lost the use of his hands after a stroke 6 months earlier, attended by his daughter Patricia. Each family carried the same mixture of desperate hope and protective skepticism that Kwame recognized in his own emotional state. The master healer greeted each participant individually, speaking to them in languages that connected to their ancestral roots. When he reached Ama, he knelt beside her wheelchair and spoke to her in Twi, the same language Kwame had heard from his grandmother's lips during his childhood. Ama didn't understand the words, but something in her expression suggested she understood their meaning. Dr. Morrison explained the protocol they would follow over the next 6 months. Each session would combine traditional healing practices with careful medical monitoring. Participants would engage in culturally specific movement therapies, receive herbal treatments prepared according to traditional recipes, and participate in community healing ceremonies designed to address spiritual as well as physical disconnection. The Western medical establishment remained skeptical of such approaches, Dr. Morrison acknowledged, but preliminary results from similar studies in Africa had shown neurological improvements that conventional treatment protocols couldn't explain. The research was designed to document these improvements while exploring the mechanisms that might account for them. Nana Akosua began the first session by having each participant share their personal history with their ancestral culture. Maria spoke of growing up in Salvador da Bahia, where Afro-Brazilian traditions had been preserved despite centuries of oppression. Her family had participated in candomblé ceremonies that combined West African spiritual practices with indigenous Brazilian elements, but she had drifted away from these traditions after moving to Chicago. James described his connection to jazz music as a continuation of African rhythmic traditions that had survived slavery and segregation in America. His grandfather had been a blues musician in Mississippi, and James had grown up understanding that music was more than entertainment. It was a form of spiritual communication that connected the living to their ancestors and to each other. When it came time for Ama to share her story, she surprised everyone by speaking with clarity and insight that seemed far beyond her 8 years. She explained that she had always felt like something was missing from her life, even before the accident. She knew her father came from Ghana, but she had never experienced the culture that had shaped his childhood. The accident had made her feel even more disconnected, as if she was floating in space without any roots to anchor her to the earth. Nana Akosua listened to each story with deep attention, occasionally nodding or asking questions that revealed the spiritual dimensions of their physical conditions. He explained that healing, in traditional African understanding, was never just about individual recovery. It was about restoring balance within the community, reconnecting people to their cultural identity, and allowing ancestral wisdom to flow through contemporary challenges. The healer's approach to Ama's condition was radically different from anything they had encountered in Western medical settings. Instead of focusing primarily on her damaged spine, Nana Akosua examined her entire energetic system, looking for disruptions in what he called her life force flow. He explained that paralysis was often accompanied by spiritual disconnection, and that physical healing required addressing both dimensions simultaneously. Using diagnostic techniques that predated modern medicine by thousands of years, Nana identified patterns in Ama's energy that corresponded to specific ancestral traumas. He spoke of historical wounds that could be passed down through family lines, creating vulnerabilities that manifested as physical ailments in subsequent generations. Ama's accident, he suggested, had activated these ancestral patterns while also creating new trauma that needed healing. The treatment protocol he designed for her combined several traditional approaches. She would participate in specific dances that were believed to stimulate nerve regeneration, receive herbal preparations that supported neurological healing, and engage in storytelling sessions that would reconnect her to her cultural heritage. Most importantly, she would be surrounded by a healing community that would hold space for her recovery. Kwame found himself struggling to balance his analytical engineering background with the intuitive wisdom Nana represented. Part of him wanted to understand the precise mechanisms by which traditional healing might work, while another part recognized that some forms of knowledge couldn't be reduced to scientific formulas. He had to learn to trust processes that didn't fit within the Western frameworks he had spent 15 years mastering. The herbal preparations Nana prescribed for Ama were complex combinations of plants that had been used for neurological conditions throughout West African history. He explained each ingredient's properties and traditional applications, while Dr. Morrison carefully documented the formulations for later chemical analysis. The integration of traditional knowledge with modern research methodology created a unique approach that honored both wisdom traditions. During their second session, Nana introduced Ama to the Adowa dance, a traditional Ghanaian form that combined graceful upper body movements with rhythmic patterns that were said to stimulate the nervous system. Even from her wheelchair, Ama could participate in the intricate hand and arm gestures that told stories of triumph over adversity. The dance required her to coordinate complex movements with polyrhythmic drumming, creating neurological stimulation that conventional physical therapy had never provided. As Ama learned the Adowa movements, something remarkable began to happen. The graceful gestures seemed to awaken muscle memory that transcended her individual experience. Her movements took on a fluidity and precision that suggested she was accessing knowledge encoded in her DNA, patterns that had been passed down through countless generations of ancestors. Dr. Morrison documented these sessions carefully, noting changes in Ama's coordination, balance, and overall body awareness. The traditional dances seemed to be creating new neural pathways in her upper body, while potentially stimulating dormant connections to her lower extremities. The mechanisms weren't understood by Western science, but the effects were measurable and significant. 3 weeks into the treatment protocol, Ama reported her first sensation below the point of injury. During a particularly intense drumming session, she felt what she described as warm tingling in her thighs. Dr. Hendricks, who was monitoring the study from the conventional medical side, was cautiously intrigued by this development. Phantom sensations were possible in spinal cord injuries, but the timing and nature of Ama's experience suggested something more complex might be occurring. The other participants in the study were experiencing their own forms of breakthrough. Maria had begun to feel sensation returning to her crushed legs during sessions that combined Brazilian capoeira movements with West African dance forms. James was regaining fine motor control in his hands through drumming exercises that seemed to rewire his brain's connection to his peripheral nervous system. What struck Dr. Morrison most profoundly was the way these individual healings were occurring within a communal context. The participants weren't just recovering in isolation. They were supporting each other's healing through shared cultural practices that created bonds deeper than typical patient support groups. The community aspect of the healing seemed to be as important as the specific therapeutic interventions. Kwame found himself changing as dramatically as his daughter. The regular participation in traditional ceremonies was reconnecting him to aspects of his identity that he had suppressed during his years of cultural assimilation in America. He began to remember stories his grandfather had told him, songs his grandmother had sung, and dances that had seemed irrelevant to his American life but were proving essential to his daughter's healing. The financial pressures that had dominated Kwame's existence for 3 years began to shift as well. The research study covered many of Ama's treatment costs, and Dr. Morrison had connected them with community organizations that provided additional support for immigrant families dealing with medical crises. More importantly, Kwame was discovering that healing didn't have to be an expensive process that required constant medical intervention. Some of the most powerful therapeutic work was happening in their apartment during their evening drumming sessions. 6 weeks into the study, Amma achieved something that her conventional medical team had declared impossible. During a ceremony dedicated to ancestral healing, she moved her left toe. The movement was slight, barely perceptible, but it was voluntary and purposeful. Dr. Hendricks confirmed that Amma was demonstrating motor function below her level of injury, something that challenged fundamental assumptions about spinal cord damage. The breakthrough created excitement within the research team, but Nana remained focused on the broader healing process. He explained that physical recovery was just one aspect of what Amma needed. She was also healing from trauma, reconnecting with her cultural identity, and learning to understand her body as part of a larger spiritual and ancestral system. As winter deepened in Chicago, the healing sessions took on increased intensity. Nana introduced more advanced ceremonial practices that required greater community participation. Kwame found himself learning traditional songs he had never heard before, while Amma mastered dance movements that seemed to flow directly from ancestral memory. The other families in the study became an extended support network that transcended their shared medical conditions. Maria and Roberto began hosting dinner parties where participants could practice traditional foods and music outside the formal research setting. James started teaching Amma jazz piano techniques that complemented her traditional dance training, creating fusion forms that honored multiple cultural traditions. Dr. Morrison's documentation of the study began to attract attention from medical researchers around the world. The improvements participants were showing couldn't be explained by conventional neurological science, but they were too consistent and well documented to dismiss as placebo effects. The integration of traditional healing with modern medical monitoring was creating a new model for treating conditions that Western medicine considered incurable. 3 months into the study, Amma was able to stand with assistance for short periods. Her legs couldn't yet support her full weight, but the return of any function below her injury level was medically unprecedented. More importantly, her overall health and emotional well-being had improved dramatically. She was sleeping better, eating with enthusiasm, and approaching each day with excitement rather than resignation. Kwame began to understand that what they were experiencing went far beyond individual medical treatment. They were participating in the restoration of cultural knowledge that had been suppressed by colonialism and marginalized by Western medical dominance. The healing practices Nana was teaching them represented thousands of years of accumulated wisdom about the human body's capacity for recovery and regeneration. The financial crisis that had brought them to the edge of homelessness was resolving as well, but not through the mechanisms Kwame had expected. Instead of finding higher-paying employment or receiving insurance settlements, they were discovering that their needs were being met through community support networks, activated by their participation in traditional healing practices. Other Ghanaian families in Chicago began reaching out after hearing about their involvement in the study. Many had children who were struggling with various medical conditions, and they were interested in exploring culturally integrated approaches to healing. Kwame found himself becoming an informal advocate for traditional medicine within the immigrant community. Dr. Morrison arranged for Kwame to speak at medical conferences about their experience with culturally integrated healing. His presentations challenged audiences of Western-trained physicians to consider approaches that fell outside their conventional training. Some dismissed his accounts as anecdotal evidence, but others were intrigued by the documented improvements in Amma's neurological function. 4 months into the study, Amma took her first assisted steps since the accident. With support from parallel bars and encouragement from the entire research community, she moved both legs in a coordinated walking pattern. The steps were shaky and required significant assistance, but they represented a recovery that conventional medicine had declared impossible. The breakthrough was documented with sophisticated medical equipment that confirmed genuine neurological recovery. New neural pathways had somehow developed that bypassed Amma's damaged spinal cord, creating alternative routes for motor signals to reach her legs. The mechanisms involved remained mysterious, but the results were undeniable. Nana explained the recovery in terms that Western science couldn't yet verify, but that made intuitive sense within traditional healing frameworks. Amma's spirit had been reconnected to her ancestral lineage, allowing healing energy to flow through channels that modern medicine didn't recognize. The community support and cultural practices had created conditions that enabled her body's innate healing wisdom to manifest in ways that isolated medical treatment couldn't achieve. The study's preliminary results were generating international attention, with researchers from universities in Ghana, Brazil, and other countries requesting collaboration on expanded research projects. The integration of traditional healing with modern medical monitoring was creating new possibilities for treating neurological conditions that had previously been considered hopeless. For Kwame, the most profound change was the restoration of hope that extended far beyond Ama's physical recovery. He was rediscovering aspects of his identity that he had thought were incompatible with success in America. The cultural traditions he had abandoned were proving to be sources of strength and healing that enriched rather than hindered their American experience. Ama's transformation was equally dramatic on emotional and spiritual levels. She had evolved from a depressed child, resigned to permanent disability, into a confident young person who understood herself as part of a larger cultural and spiritual continuum. Her physical recovery was remarkable, but her psychological healing was equally significant. As the study approached its 6-month conclusion, Dr. Morrison began preparing research papers that would challenge fundamental assumptions about neurological recovery and the role of culture in medical treatment. The documented improvements in all participants suggested that traditional healing practices might offer genuine therapeutic benefits that Western medicine was only beginning to understand. The final month of formal treatment would test everything they had learned about the integration of traditional and modern approaches to healing. Ama was scheduled to participate in a completion ceremony that would mark her transition from patient to recovered community member, while the research team prepared to share their findings with medical establishments that might not be ready to accept their implications. But regardless of how the broader medical community responded to their discoveries, Kwame knew that he and Ama had found something more valuable than any cure. They had rediscovered their connection to cultural traditions that offered healing not just for individual ailments, but for the deeper spiritual disconnection that plagued so many immigrant families struggling to maintain their identity in a new country. The drumming sessions that had begun as desperate attempts to connect with their heritage had become powerful therapeutic interventions that were transforming not just their family, but their entire understanding of what healing could encompass. As they prepared for the final phase of their journey, they carried with them the knowledge that some forms of medicine couldn't be reduced to pills or procedures, but required the restoration of cultural and spiritual connections that made human beings whole. The completion ceremony took place on a Saturday morning in May, when spring had finally claimed Chicago's streets and the university research facility felt less like a medical institution and more like a celebration hall. 6 months of traditional healing had transformed not just Ama's physical condition, but the entire understanding of what recovery could mean within a cultural context that honored both ancient wisdom and contemporary medical knowledge. Dr. Morrison stood before an audience of medical professionals, university administrators, and community members who had gathered to witness the conclusion of what would become one of the most documented cases of culturally integrated neurological healing in modern medical history. The research findings were unprecedented, but the human story they represented was even more remarkable. Ama sat in her wheelchair at the center of the ceremonial space, but today the chair was decorated with kente cloth and surrounded by the traditional instruments that had become central to her healing journey. She wore a dress made from fabric that Kwame's sister had sent from Ghana, and her hair was styled in intricate braids that connected her to generations of ancestors who had faced their own seemingly impossible challenges. Nana began the ceremony by acknowledging the spirits of all who had contributed to Ama's healing, including the ancestors whose wisdom had guided the process and the contemporary healers who had supported her journey. He spoke in multiple languages, honoring the diverse cultural traditions represented by the families who had participated in the study. When he called Ama forward, she surprised everyone by standing from her wheelchair without assistance. Her legs were still weak and her balance uncertain, but she was able to support her own weight for several minutes at a time. The medical team had documented steady improvement in her motor function over the past 2 months, but her ability to stand independently represented a milestone that conventional medicine had declared impossible. With support from parallel bars that had been decorated with traditional African textiles, Ama performed a modified version of the Adawa dance that she had been learning throughout her treatment. Her movements were slow and deliberate, but they were genuine expressions of the dance form that had been central to her cultural healing. Each gesture told part of her story, from the trauma of her accident, through the journey of recovery, to her current state of renewed wholeness. The audience watched in profound silence as an 8-year-old girl who had been permanently paralyzed demonstrated motor function that challenged fundamental assumptions about spinal cord injuries. But beyond the medical significance of her recovery, Ama's dance represented something even more powerful: the restoration of cultural identity as a pathway to healing that encompassed physical, emotional, and spiritual dimensions. Dr. Hendricks, who had initially been skeptical of the traditional healing approach, found herself fighting back tears as she watched her former patient demonstrate abilities that her medical training had told her were impossible. The documentation was comprehensive and undeniable. Ama had developed new neural pathways that bypassed her damaged spinal cord, creating alternative routes for motor signals to reach her legs. The mechanisms involved remained mysterious from a Western scientific perspective, but the results spoke to possibilities that medical research was only beginning to explore. Dr. Morrison's study had created a bridge between traditional healing wisdom and contemporary medical documentation that opened new avenues for treating conditions that had previously been considered hopeless. Maria Santos was the next participant to demonstrate her recovery. The Brazilian dancer, whose legs had been crushed in an industrial accident, was able to walk across the ceremonial space using only a single walking stick for balance. Her improvement had been as dramatic as Ama's, progressing from complete paralysis to functional mobility through a combination of traditional Afro-Brazilian healing practices and community support. James Wheeler, the jazz musician who had lost the use of his hands after a stroke, performed a piano composition he had written specifically for the ceremony. His fine motor control had returned to the point where he could play complex musical passages. Though his technique was different from his pre-stroke abilities, the music he created seemed to flow directly from his healing journey, incorporating traditional African rhythms with contemporary jazz harmonies. Each participant's recovery had followed a unique trajectory, but all had shared certain common elements: the restoration of cultural identity, participation in community healing practices, and the integration of traditional wisdom with contemporary medical support. The study's findings suggested that healing was far more complex and culturally specific than Western medicine typically acknowledged. Dr. Morrison presented the research findings to the assembled audience, explaining that the documented improvements in all participants challenged existing paradigms about neurological recovery. The integration of traditional healing practices with modern medical monitoring had created a new model for treating conditions that conventional medicine considered incurable. The preliminary results had already attracted international attention, with researchers from universities in Ghana, Brazil, Nigeria, and other countries requesting collaboration on expanded studies. The approach they had developed in Chicago was being replicated in medical centers around the world, creating a global network of culturally integrated healing research. But the ceremony wasn't just about medical breakthroughs. It was about the restoration of cultural wisdom that had been marginalized by centuries of colonialism and medical imperialism. Nana spoke about the responsibility they all carried to share this knowledge with communities that had been taught to distrust their own healing traditions in favor of Western medical approaches that often failed them. Kwame found himself called to speak about their family's journey from medical crisis to cultural healing. He described the desperation that had brought them to the study, the gradual process of reconnecting with their Ghanaian heritage, and the way traditional healing had restored not just Ama's physical function but their entire family's sense of purpose and identity. As he spoke, Kwame realized that their story had implications far beyond individual medical treatment. They had discovered that immigrant families facing medical crises often needed more than just clinical interventions. They needed approaches that honored their cultural identity and drew upon the healing wisdom their ancestors had developed over thousands of years. The ceremony concluded with a community dance that included all the participants and their families. Ama was able to participate from a standing position, using the parallel bars for support but moving her legs in coordination with the traditional rhythms. Her movements were slow and careful, but they were genuine expressions of the dance forms that had been central to her recovery. As the drumming reached its crescendo, something extraordinary happened. Ama released her grip on the parallel bars and took 3 independent steps before Kwame caught her in his arms. The steps were unsteady, and she couldn't sustain independent walking for more than a few seconds, but she had demonstrated genuine bipedal locomotion for the first time since her accident. The audience erupted in celebration, but Nana raised his hand for silence. He explained that Ama's physical recovery was remarkable, but it was only one aspect of her healing journey. She had also recovered her connection to her cultural heritage, her sense of belonging within a healing community, and her understanding of herself as part of a larger spiritual and ancestral continuum. In the weeks that followed the ceremony, the study's findings were published in multiple medical journals, generating intense debate within the international medical community. Some researchers dismissed the results as poorly controlled anecdotal evidence, while others recognized the implications for expanding treatment approaches for neurological conditions. Dr. Morrison received funding to establish a permanent center for culturally integrated healing at Northwestern University, creating the first institutional framework for research that combined traditional healing practices with contemporary medical documentation. The center would offer treatment protocols for patients whose conditions had not responded to conventional approaches, while conducting rigorous research on the mechanisms involved in cultural healing. Ama continued to improve steadily, progressing from assisted walking to independent mobility with the aid of forearm crutches. By her 9th birthday, she was able to walk short distances without any assistive devices, though she still used her wheelchair for longer journeys. More importantly, she had become an advocate for culturally integrated healing approaches, speaking to medical audiences about her experience with traditional African healing practices. Kwame found his life transformed in ways that extended far beyond his daughter's medical recovery. He had been offered a position with Dr. Morrison's research center, where he would help develop treatment protocols for other immigrant families facing medical crises. His engineering background proved valuable in creating systematic approaches to traditional healing that could be documented and replicated. The financial crisis that had once threatened to destroy their family had been replaced by stability and purpose. But more importantly, they had discovered that healing was not just about fixing individual problems. It was about restoring connections between people and their cultural heritage, between families and their communities, and between contemporary challenges and ancient wisdom. The other families from the study had become an extended support network that continued to meet regularly for traditional healing practices and community celebrations. Maria and Roberto had established a cultural center in Chicago's Brazilian community that offered traditional Afro-Brazilian healing alongside conventional medical services. James had formed a jazz ensemble that incorporated African traditional rhythms into contemporary musical performances. 6 months after the completion ceremony, Ama was featured on the cover of a major medical journal alongside an article about culturally integrated approaches to neurological healing. The photograph showed her standing independently beside traditional African drums, representing the bridge between ancient healing wisdom and contemporary medical possibilities. Dr. Morrison's research had demonstrated that some forms of healing required more than individual medical treatment. They required the restoration of cultural identity, community support, and spiritual connections that Western medicine often overlooked. The implications extended far beyond neurological conditions to encompass approaches to mental health, chronic illness, and preventative medicine. Nana returned to Ghana after the study's completion, but he had trained local healers in Chicago to continue the work with immigrant communities facing medical challenges. The traditional healing practices he had brought from West Africa were now being integrated with medical treatment in hospitals and clinics throughout the American Midwest. For Ame, the most profound change was not physical, but psychological. She had evolved from a depressed child resigned to permanent disability into a confident young person who understood her recovery as part of a larger story about cultural resilience and healing wisdom. She spoke fluent Twi now, having learned her father's native language as part of her cultural reconnection. The drumming sessions that had begun as desperate attempts to maintain hope had become powerful family traditions that connected them to their heritage while celebrating their contemporary American experience. The small apartment that had once felt cramped and limiting now felt abundant with cultural richness and community connections. On the first anniversary of Ama's first independent steps, the family returned to Ghana for an extended visit with Kwame's relatives. Ama was able to walk through the red dust of her ancestral village, participate in traditional ceremonies that had been passed down through generations, and meet the extended family who had supported their healing journey through prayers and traditional rituals performed thousands of miles away. The trip represented the completion of a circle that had begun with Kwame's immigration to America 15 years earlier. He had left Ghana believing that success required abandoning old traditions in favor of Western approaches to life and healing. His daughter's recovery had taught him that true healing often required the integration of multiple wisdom traditions rather than the rejection of ancestral knowledge. Standing in his family's compound, watching Amma dance with her cousins to rhythms that had pulsed through West African communities for millennia, Kwame understood that their story was about more than medical recovery. It was about the power of cultural identity to heal wounds that went deeper than individual trauma, connecting people to sources of strength and wisdom that transcended the limitations of any single healing tradition. The little girl, who had been told she would never walk again, was now running through the same red dust that had nourished countless generations of her ancestors, carrying within her body the living proof that some forms of healing required not just medical intervention, but the restoration of connections to cultural identity, ancestral wisdom, and community support that made human beings whole. Their journey from medical crisis to cultural healing had demonstrated that recovery was not just about fixing broken bodies, but about remembering forgotten connections between contemporary challenges and ancient sources of strength that could transform seemingly impossible situations into stories of hope and renewal. The transformation rippled outward from their family into the broader Chicago community in ways that surprised everyone involved in the original research study. 3 months after returning from Ghana, Kwame received a phone call that would reshape their understanding of how individual healing could spark collective change. The caller was Dr. Susan Chen, Chief of Pediatric Neurology at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, and her voice carried the urgency of someone who had encountered something that challenged her fundamental assumptions about medical practice. She had read Dr. Morrison's published research about culturally integrated healing and wanted to discuss a case that was baffling her entire medical team. 8-year-old Marcus Thompson, an African-American child from North Philadelphia, had suffered a traumatic brain injury in a bicycle accident 6 months earlier. Despite aggressive medical intervention, he remained in a persistent vegetative state with no response to conventional treatments. His grandmother, a woman named Ruby Thompson who had grown up in rural Alabama, had been asking the medical team to consider what she called the old ways of healing, but the hospital had dismissed her suggestions as folk superstition. Dr. Chen explained that she had initially shared her colleagues' skepticism about traditional healing approaches, but Marcus's case had forced her to reconsider. The family had begun conducting what they called prayer circles in the child's hospital room, incorporating spiritual songs and rhythmic clapping that seemed to create measurable changes in his brain activity. The neurological monitoring equipment was detecting patterns of neural response that occurred only during these informal healing sessions. Kwame found himself being asked to consult on a case that existed at the intersection of medical crisis and cultural healing, exactly the territory he had learned to navigate during Amma's recovery. Dr. Chen wanted to understand whether the integrated approach that had worked for Amma might be applicable to traumatic brain injury, a condition that conventional medicine considered even more hopeless than spinal cord damage. The request forced Kwame to confront questions about his own role in what was becoming a movement toward culturally integrated medical care. Was he qualified to advise other families facing medical crises? Could the specific healing practices that had worked for Amma be adapted to different cultural contexts and medical conditions? How could traditional healing wisdom be shared responsibly without creating false hope or interfering with necessary medical treatment? Dr. Morrison encouraged Kwame to accept the consultation, explaining that the field of culturally integrated healing needed advocates who could speak from personal experience while understanding both traditional and contemporary medical approaches. She offered to collaborate on developing protocols that could be adapted to different cultural contexts and medical conditions. The trip to Philadelphia introduced Kwame and Amma to Ruby Thompson, a 73-year-old woman whose presence filled hospital corridors with the same quiet authority that Nana had brought to their own healing journey. She had grown up in the rural South during the era of segregation, when African-American communities had maintained their own healing traditions out of necessity rather than choice. Ruby's approach to her grandson's condition drew upon spiritual practices that had sustained her community through generations of hardship. She spoke of healing as something that required the participation of the entire extended family, not just medical professionals. The prayer circles she had been conducting in Marcus's hospital room were based on traditions that predated slavery, rhythmic practices that created what she called pathways for the spirit to return to the body. Amma's presence at the consultation proved crucial in ways that surprised everyone involved. When she entered Marcus's hospital room and began speaking to the unconscious boy in Twi, His neurological monitors showed the most significant brain activity patterns his medical team had recorded in months. The connection between the two children transcended their different cultural backgrounds, creating a bridge between healing experiences that had seemed unique to their individual situations. Working with Ruby Thompson and Dr. Chen, Kwame helped develop a treatment protocol that combined intensive medical monitoring with traditional healing practices rooted in African American spiritual traditions. The approach was similar to what had worked for Amma, but adapted to accommodate Marcus's specific cultural context and medical condition. The healing sessions for Marcus incorporated gospel music, call-and-response vocals, and rhythmic clapping that created patterns of auditory stimulation designed to encourage neurological recovery. Ruby led these sessions with the skill of someone who had been practicing community healing for decades, while medical technicians documented changes in brain activity that occurred during the traditional healing practices. Within 2 weeks of beginning the integrated treatment protocol, Marcus began showing signs of emerging consciousness. His responses were subtle at first. Slight movements of his fingers during healing sessions, changes in breathing patterns that corresponded to specific musical rhythms. But the improvements were consistent and measurable, representing the first genuine progress in his condition since the accident. The case attracted national attention when Marcus opened his eyes during a healing session and spoke his first word in 6 months. The word was "grandmama," directed toward Ruby during a particularly intense prayer circle that had been ongoing for 3 hours. The neurological recovery that followed challenged medical understanding of traumatic brain injury as completely as Amma's case had challenged assumptions about spinal cord damage. Dr. Chen found herself leading a research team that was documenting the most significant breakthroughs in consciousness recovery that contemporary medicine had ever recorded. But more than the medical implications, she was discovering that healing often required approaches that honored the cultural and spiritual dimensions of human experience in ways that conventional medical training had never addressed. The success with Marcus led to requests from medical centers across the country for consultation on cases that had exhausted conventional treatment options. Kwame found himself traveling to hospitals in Detroit, Atlanta, Los Angeles, and other cities with large immigrant and minority populations, helping medical teams develop culturally integrated approaches to seemingly hopeless conditions. Each case taught him something new about the intersection of traditional healing with contemporary medical practice. In Detroit, he worked with a Hmong family whose daughter was recovering from a stroke, using healing practices that combined traditional Hmong shamanism with modern rehabilitation techniques. In Atlanta, he consulted on a case involving a young Latino man whose paralysis was being treated through a combination of Mexican folk healing and conventional physical therapy. The patterns that emerged from these various cases suggested that culturally integrated healing was not just applicable to specific ethnic communities or medical conditions. It was a broader approach that recognized healing as a process that encompassed cultural identity, community support, and spiritual dimensions that conventional medicine often overlooked. Amma's role in these consultations evolved from patient to healer, as she demonstrated an intuitive understanding of how to connect with other children facing medical crises. Her ability to communicate hope and possibility to young patients who had been told their conditions were hopeless proved to be as therapeutically significant as any specific medical intervention. At 10 years old, Amma was walking independently for short distances and participating in traditional Ghanaian dances with a grace that seemed to flow directly from her healing journey. But more importantly, she had become an ambassador for the possibility of recovery in situations where medical professionals had given up hope. The financial pressures that had once threatened to destroy their family had been replaced by opportunities that seemed to flow naturally from their commitment to sharing healing wisdom with other families facing similar crises. Kwame was offered a permanent position developing culturally integrated healing protocols for the National Institutes of Health, work that would allow him to influence medical policy at the highest levels of American healthcare. But the most significant change was in their understanding of what healing meant within the context of immigrant communities struggling to maintain their cultural identity while accessing American medical care. They had discovered that effective treatment often required bridging traditional healing wisdom with contemporary medical technology in ways that honored both approaches. The drumming sessions that had begun as desperate attempts to maintain hope during Amma's medical crisis had evolved into community healing circles that served dozens of families in Chicago's West African immigrant community. Their apartment, once a cramped space that felt like a prison, had become a gathering place where traditional healing practices were being preserved and adapted for contemporary American contexts. Dr. Morrison's research center had documented over 40 cases of significant medical improvement among patients who had participated in culturally integrated healing protocols. The success rate was challenging fundamental assumptions about the effectiveness of traditional healing practices and forcing medical institutions to reconsider approaches that had been dismissed as unscientific. The international attention their work was receiving had led to collaboration with medical researchers in Ghana, Nigeria, Brazil, and other countries, where traditional healing practices had never been completely displaced by Western medical approaches. These partnerships were creating global networks for sharing healing wisdom that transcended national and cultural boundaries. For Kwame, the most profound realization was that their individual family crisis had connected them to healing traditions that belonged to all of humanity, not just specific cultural communities. The rhythmic practices that had been central to Ama's recovery existed in various forms throughout the world, representing universal human understanding of the connections between sound, movement, community, and healing. As they prepared for their second trip to Ghana, this time to present their healing work at an international conference on traditional medicine, Kwame reflected on the journey that had taken them from medical desperation to cultural renewal. The little girl who had been told she would never walk again was now planning to dance at the conference, demonstrating traditional Ghanaian movements that had been central to her neurological recovery. Their story had become part of a larger narrative about the potential for healing approaches that honored both ancient wisdom and contemporary knowledge, creating possibilities for recovery that neither tradition could achieve alone. The drumbeats that had once been desperate attempts to maintain hope had become rhythmic bridges connecting their family to healing possibilities that transformed not just individual patients, but entire communities' understanding of what recovery could encompass. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.